All right, so hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar event. What we hope you'll find to be an engaging and insightful discussion on the topic of maritime governance. So my name is Jennifer Steele, and I'm the Manager of Research and Knowledge Mobilization here at Clear Seas. I'll be joined here today shortly by my colleague Meghan Mathieson, as well as some of the members from an amazing team of researchers from both Dalhousie University and the Memorial University of Newfoundland, who we partnered with on this work and who we're very pleased to host the discussion with today. So before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge that today I'm personally speaking from the traditional territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations, where my home is located in Vancouver, British Columbia, and which is also home to Clear Seas headquarters. That being said, our mandate serves all peoples in Canada, including First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, from coast to coast to coast. So after this word of welcome, we're going to start things off with a brief overview of the research initiative that we're featuring here today and relay some of the objectives for why Clear Seas supported this work. Once we've set that context, we're going to open things right up into a moderated panel session, and we have some great questions lined up for the members of the research team joining us today. So this is a facilitated conversation with the research team. We will have the Q&A function open throughout the webinar, and we'll try and reserve some time to answer audience questions. So before we get started, a few words about Clear Seas. For anyone who doesn't know us or about our organization, Clear Seas is a not-for-profit and independent research center that provides impartial and fact-based information on marine shipping. Our work focuses on identifying and sharing best practices for the safe and sustainable marine shipping in Canada and beyond, and encompasses the human, environmental, and economic impacts of the shipping industry. So Clear Seas runs programs that are geared towards expanding the reach of marine shipping research, knowledge, and skills, including an Indigenous internship program and an Indigenous career pivot program, helping to create meaningful opportunities for work experience and employment in the marine industry across Canada. We do work to help fill knowledge gaps by conducting new research and by sharing information in a way that is clear and accessible. We have a big focus on knowledge mobilization. We release different types of research and communications products with some of the examples shown here, and topical issues that are related to marine shipping and that are aimed for policymakers and industry as well as the general public. So a core tenet of our work, as you can read here, is about communicating on complex issues such as maritime governance. Getting at these complex issues for us starts with a better understanding and better information, which we generate through our in-house research work, as well as through research partners such as the Demystifying Maritime Governance Project we're here to talk about today. So that leads us really nicely into our Demystifying Maritime Governance Project context. So as I've alluded to, maritime governance is complex. And it's critical. So for shipping to remain safe and sustainable, it's essential that robust and well-managed and accountable governance processes are in place. And while we do have rules and systems in place, maritime governance is not always clear, open, and transparent, and it's an ever-evolving system. So understanding that system and how it works can be challenging, even for those people who work in the maritime shipping sector, including political, governmental, and industry decision makers, let alone the more general public. So Clear Seas saw a need for a clear and accessible resource on maritime governance. So we put out an open call for proposals and partnered with a team of researchers from Dalhousie and Memorial Universities on a multi-year and multi-part research project with the goals to help increase knowledge on maritime governance frameworks in Canada and to add clarity around the complexities of governance of shipping. So this work also included 4 sub-projects that explored a range of transformative issue areas affecting maritime governance today, including the interface between marine shipping and Indigenous rights, the significance of marine spatial planning for shipping, the role of risk governance and self-regulation with the focus on search and rescue and oil spill response, and finally, the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the occupational health and safety of seafarers. The different work streams that were carried out as part of the project were supported by a blended grant. Principal funding was provided from Clear Seas and MyTax, which the MyTax funding helped to support the hiring of 4 student interns for the project. As well, contributed funding was provided from the Safe Navigation and Environment Protection Project, supported by the Ocean Frontier Institute with the Canada First Research Excellence Grant. So the project and the sub-project, those areas helped to create a series of resources on maritime governance. The first was a comprehensive multi-part report that breaks down the global and domestic structures, frameworks, actors, interconnections, and processes involved in maritime governance. So other outputs were some infographics that helped to illustrate some important governance concepts. And the research also supported a series of articles on those more contemporary issues that we explored in the sub-projects, with some of the in-depth results that are expected to be released in some different academic publications this year. So you can find these resources on our project page of the Clear Seas website, the link to which we'll provide in the chat. So last but not least, on my introduction slides here, this incredible multidisciplinary research team that did this work. So the extensive research and the resources that the project created are also the credit of this talented group of academic researchers led by co-PIs Aldo Cherkov at Dalhousie University and Desai Shan at Memorial. So I'm not going to list off the full team here by name, as that might take a little bit too much time, but you can see here the breadth of skill and expertise across some of the many different domains related to maritime governance, including law, health, environmental planning, naval architecture, and engineering. So if our messaging around the complexity of governance today hasn't quite sunk in yet, just looking at the composition of the team here itself is an indicator of the range of things that a robust governance system must consider. So we're really honored to have some of the team members join us today. And with that introduction, I'm going to hand things over to Meghan and to our panel of speakers to get into that conversation on governance. So Meghan, over to you.
Thanks so much, Jen. Yes, I'm Meghan Mathieson. I'm the Director of Strategy and Innovation with Clear Seas, and I'm very excited to get to dive into the rich and complex topic of maritime governance today. We'll be touching on a number of areas of interest to illustrate how shipping activity is regulated and managed in Canada and internationally. I'll be posing some questions to our panel of experts for their reflections, and they will turn on their camera to join me on the screen as they answer. Audience members, you're encouraged to submit your own questions using the Q&A feature, and that will be monitored so that we can incorporate your questions into the conversation as time allows today. So let's start with a focus on the pertinent topic of pollution from ships. The International Convention to Prevent Pollution from Ships, otherwise known as MARPOL, was enacted 50 years ago in 1973, and it sets out restrictions on what ships can and cannot dispose of at sea. I'd like to ask Aldo Cherkov to give us some thoughts on why ships are allowed to dispose of certain types of waste in certain areas. And those certain areas are often a specific distance from shore. So how are those distances from shore and concentrations of waste and rates of discharge decided? So what ships can discharge where? What was the rationale behind that?
Hello, and thank you very much, Megan, for those questions. Perhaps it is useful to start at the outset by saying that the convention that you refer to, the International Convention for the Prevention of Pollution from Ships, is the most important international legal instrument to regulate the various wastes that may be generated by ships and what can be done with these wastes. So this is an area which is heavily regulated. Ships necessarily produce waste because of their operations. We have to bear in mind that there are people on board ships, and if you have people, obviously there's going to be a range of waste produced in the form perhaps of garbage, sewage, simply because you have persons on board. But in addition to that, there are additional wastes produced by ships because ships are carrying different cargoes in their holds. And indeed, those holds need to be cleaned up so that they can take on the next cargo and so on. And in addition to that, there are other operational wastes produced on board the ships, such as various oils, like engine room oil, and so on. So basically, this convention addresses these wastes and what can be done with them. So the vast majority of wastes cannot really be released at sea. They are regulated, and for instance, oily waste, they cannot really be released at sea. And if there is any oily waste on board the ship, when it enters port, it has to discharge it at an appropriate facility in a port. Other types of waste, like sewage, if sewage can be treated on board, if the ship has a proper plant that treats this waste, then some of it may be, it can actually be released at sea at certain distances from the coast or the ice edge in the case of northern waters. Most garbage cannot be released in the marine environment. There is some that may be, but garbage such as plastics, for instance, is a no-no. It must be discharged at a port facility on land. So what governs essentially the discharges is a distance requirement. When they are permitted, those instances when waste can be discharged into the marine environment, they have to discharge at a certain distance from the shoreline, and usually also according to a certain volume, in the case of sewage, and at a certain speed of the ship. You probably wonder how have these distances and discharge rates been determined? Well, they've been determined on the basis, of course, of some scientific consideration of distances in terms of the ability of the marine environment, the ocean energy perhaps, to break them down, and also the assimilative capacity. So that is why we see these distances. They are not necessarily arbitrary distances or discharge rates.
Is there any element of what a country can regulate and enforce in the distances, 3 nautical miles or 12 nautical miles or 24 nautical miles from shore?
Well, basically, states have to work on the basis of the instruments they are party to. What we have to bear in mind is that there are international navigation rights, and a state cannot arbitrarily regulate basically the passage of ships that are purely transiting their waters, what we call innocent passage or transit passage. So this is why this international convention we've been talking about, so-called MARPOL, sets international standards to enable ships to essentially observe those waste management requirements, and then to enable also, of course, flex states. So in other words, those states that have registered those ships to enforce those laws on board ships, and also for coastal states like Canada, for example, then to regulate the discharge from ships in accordance with those international standards. Now, there are certain limitations in terms of how far Canada could, for instance, regulate, because if ships are simply transited, they have the right of innocent passage to continue navigating. However, they have a duty in exercising their navigation right not to cause willful pollution. Because if they are causing willful pollution in violation of these international standards, then of course there's a power of enforcement over their ships.
Yeah, I think that's a really important distinction. You have right of passage, but you can't do anything you want. There's still rules in effect. So you've raised the idea there's behavior that ships can have while they're within domestic waters. There's international waters, and thinking about Canada as a coastal state with our very near neighbor, the United States, there are some differences in how pollution is addressed between the certain U.S. states. Have higher limitations on what can be discharged in their coastal waters. So thinking about Washington, California, and Alaska specifically on the West Coast, they each have different limitations in effect. And I'm wondering, can you talk a little bit about why some U.S. states are able to implement pollution prevention measures that Canadian provinces don't have that same ability?
Well, we have different constitutional systems to start with. But rather than starting with differences, I think it is important to emphasize that there are actually far more similarities than there are differences. And the reason is because Canada and the United States are parties to the same international instruments, and they've domesticated these instruments within their respective jurisdictions. Now, what we have to bear in mind, though, is that in the case of the United States, member states of that union enjoy certain powers that perhaps the provinces don't. Actually, not perhaps, they do not in Canada. So, for example, U.S. states have jurisdiction over the territorial sea in their case. Our provinces, well, at law, they don't have that jurisdiction, although, of course, we know historically that some provinces have claimed that, but it is a controversial issue in Canada. So there are differences, jurisdictional differences in that sense. So in our constitution, navigation and shipping are really federal matters. So as a result, they are legislated, regulated at the national level. Now, that is also true for most issues in the United States. But there are also particular differences there because there are certain things that can be done at a local level because those local levels have been properly empowered to do so. Now, in our case, we have not gone that far, but we do have, for instance, port authorities under the Canada Marine Act that have been given certain powers as well. So they are able to adopt bylaws and to address vessel traffic management and related issues, services to ships within the port environment. And using those powers, they could potentially also have an impact on reducing the environmental impact of shipping. So it's not that we are not able in our system to also address some of the issues in shipping at other levels of government in addition to the federal level. We can. There is some authority, but we have to bear in mind that there are constitutional constraints.
Thank you, Aldo. That's, I think, a really important distinction between how the US operates in Canada, even though, as you say, we are both party to the same MARPOL regulatory instrument. So to pick up on what you mentioned about port authorities, there's a number of port authorities within Canada, and they have certain rights and can implement restrictions in their jurisdiction, which is the area that the port has authority over. Can you talk a little bit more about a specific example? Perhaps scrubbers is one that comes to mind when some port authorities have created additional restrictions around what ships can discharge in their jurisdictions. What authority do ports have there, and what limitations are there?
Well, of course, the question of scrubbers starts really with the use of power, or rather, essentially, the fuel that is used to generate power on board a ship. And when a ship is in port, it still needs power, basically, to be able to operate its basic systems and so on. Now, what we have to bear in mind is here we are increasingly seeing in Canada a number of ports that are looking at providing power for ships while they're in ports. For example, cruise ships. And this is a very, very important move from the part of ports, because what they are doing effectively is they are providing power directly to the ship so that the ship does not need to burn fossil fuels to generate power on board. So already what that means is that they are reducing emissions from the operation of the ship because they are receiving shore power. Now, the question of scrubbers comes in because there is a particular rule concerning sulfur content. Now, thankfully, in Canada, we have the North American Emission Control Area. And Canadian ports south of 60 are covered by this area. And what this means is that there are restrictions for the emission of certain toxic substances, such as, for instance, sulfur, which we know is a problem for human health, but also, of course, for the environment. Now, the sulfur content is, permissible sulfur content is actually very low in emission control areas. It's the lowest that is available for any other region around the world. So what that means is that there is actually less sulfur discharge in emission control areas than there would be, of course, in other trading environments. Now, why is this important? It is important because those ships, in order to meet that high emission standard, they have to burn fuels that are very low in sulfur. So basically, if they're burning fuels that are very low in sulfur, then technically they don't need to use the scrubber. However, for those ships that are still using heavy fuel oil, in order to meet the low discharge requirement, they have to use the scrubber. And when they use scrubbers, they have a choice between open loop and closed loop. And this is where the problem starts, because the use of scrubbers does generate wash water. And the problem with wash water, especially with open loop system, is that the wash water has to go somewhere. And that has been known to be discharged in the marine environment and cause local environmental pollution, basically. And with the case of closed loop systems, the residue is supposed to be discharged at an appropriate port reception facility. So what ports can help with here is to provide proper reception facilities for the residue of closed loop systems. But at the same time, ports can also, as part of their conditions for entry into port, impose certain requirements on ships in terms of their ability to discharge anything into the marine environment. And of course, they would have to do this in consultation with Transport Canada, because Transport Canada is the regulatory agency for shipping, but ports also have a mandate within the Canada Marine Act to be able to manage and sustainably operate a port environment. So there is, through a collaborative approach, potentially a way how to minimize the problem of scuppers. I should mention too that the problem with scuppers is that this technology has created a new, it has tried to solve a type of pollution from ships, and that is the emission of sulfur as well as other substances. But in doing so, it has created a new form of marine pollution, and that is the wash water generated from their use. And it's causing a problem because a country like Canada is a party to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. And a fundamental duty that we have under that convention is to protect and preserve the marine environment. So we have to be careful here how we regulate shipping. In trying to solve one problem, we should not be creating another problem for the marine environment.
Yeah, classic 1 step forward, 2 steps back. But great to see that there are ways that Canada can place restrictions. And I believe in the case of scrubbers, the Port of Vancouver, Port of Montreal, and Port of Sept-Îles have all limited the use of scrubbers within their jurisdictions, and the Port of Prince Rupert is planning to follow suit. So there's more restrictions going up to protect the water in Canadian jurisdiction as we speak. So Aldo, thank you so much for providing your thoughts here. We could probably delve into your expertise all day, but I think we're going to switch gears now. And I'd like to start thinking about marine spatial planning and marine protected areas. Scrubber wash water is one pollutant that can cause harm to the marine environment. And so there's been a lot of talk about the health of the ocean. And for example, last week, Canada was a host for the 5th International Marine Protected Areas Congress here in Vancouver. And the international commitment to protect 30% of the ocean by 2030 was a big topic of conversation. And so I'd like to ask Wei Shan to join me to share your thoughts on Canada's ability to support that goal when it comes to restricting shipping activity. What powers does Canada have to restrict shipping activities, thinking about marine protected areas and marine spatial planning? And for areas that have already been designated as protected, can new restrictions be imposed in those areas?
Okay, hi. I'm happy to answer these questions. So Canada's commitment to protect at least 30% of its oceans by 2030 is part of its larger commitment to protect its marine ecosystems and biodiversity under national jurisdiction. So Canada has environmental jurisdiction in its internal waters, territorial sea, and exclusive economic zones. It can regulate shipping for marine conservation. And so far, principal tools being used include designating marine protected areas, national marine conservation areas, and marine national wildlife areas. So shipping is not totally banned in these protected areas, especially for ships transiting through or passing by these areas, but shipping is closely monitored for the purposes of marine conservation. So last week, Fisheries and Oceans Canada just released Canada's new federal marine protected areas protection standards. And from those standards, we can see there are like enhanced restrictions on vessel discharges, such as sewage, wastewater, and food waste. And there are 4 key industrial activities are prohibited from this standard. And this standard, so any shipping activities that are related to those key activities will also be regulated by this new standard. So to achieve consistency among new and existing MPAs, increased restrictions or voluntary restriction may be pursued in the future, and depending on the specific activities. And there are also some concerns regarding vessel operational discharges and air emissions, ship strikes, and underwater noise. So Canada has also developed some area-based management tools to manage shipping activities, such as area to be avoided and seasonal speed restrictions. So go back to the question of what power does it have and who has the power. So apparently shipping is a shared mandate among different departments. So Transport Canada and Coast Guards are responsible for enforcing federal legislations and policy frameworks or instruments for regulating shipping activities in Canadian waters. But besides this, Fisheries and Oceans Canada, Parks Agency, and ECCC, they can also support safe and efficient shipping in Canadian waters and protect the marine environment. Furthermore, Transport Canada can also play a role in supporting the management of MPAs by setting up some minimum standards for ships operating in MPAs. And at last, I would like to mention that during this process, Oceans Protection Plan is playing a helpful and supplementary role to coordinate different departments and allow interdepartmental collaboration in shipping governance.
Thank you. It does sound quite complex when you mention that there's Transport Canada, Coast Guard, Fisheries and Oceans, Parks Canada, and Environment and Climate Change Canada. Do they each use different mechanisms or different laws to be able to protect the marine environment, or are they all working from the same set of regulations?
Well, they have the mandates under the Oceans Act 1996 to designate marine protected. So Fisheries Oceans Canada will designate marine protected areas, and Parks Canada agency, for example, they will and they can designate national marine conservation areas. And under different policies and shipping activities will be managed differently under different frameworks. And DFO is also developing a national marine spatial planning framework. And I think that framework will also have some influence in, help to contribute how shipping can manage in a sustainable way and within those areas.
That does sound promising. Hopefully that will help everybody be on the same page with a national marine spatial planning framework when it comes to managing shipping activity. Thank you so much, Wei-Shan, for sharing your expertise in that area. I think let's switch our focus now, moving from the impact of ships on the ocean, which is what we've been talking about mostly, to think about those people who operate the ships and make it possible for each of us to enjoy the goods and services that make up the majority of our daily lives. Despite the essential role played by seafarers in the world economy, the maritime industry is experiencing global mariner shortages, and mariners are experiencing isolation, long periods away from home, denial of shore leave, and sometimes withheld wages. Desai, can you come on screen to talk to us about the role that governance can play in creating a better working environment for seafarers? And how effective are those regulations when you're on board a ship and away from shore?
Thank you so much, Megan. Sure, definitely. This is a great question. Actually, the problem you mentioned, the shortage of seafarers, has been long existed problem in both of the global shipping sector and Canadian shipping sector. So if we are going to look at the role that governance can play compared to the pollution governance discussed by Aldo and Wei-Shan, actually maritime labor governance may need to involve even wider authorities and stakeholders to ensure decent working conditions at sea. Maritime labor governance, briefly speaking, is constituted of flag state, port state, and labor supply state authorities' efforts. So at the global level, currently the primary maritime legal instrument is the Maritime Labor Convention 2006 and its amendments. So this is the major instrument of the maritime labor governance, how it could be structured, how it could work, operated, and enforced. So considering the current practices of the flag of convenience, and or alternatively, we can use the word open registries. So that is basically quite pervasive in the international ship management. That means a stronger coordination of the maritime labor governance will require flag states, port states, and labor supply states or efforts to ensure. So flag states, for example, popular flag states could be Panama, Bahama, Liberia. So they first need, as the members of the Maritime Labor Convention, first they need to establish and pass legislations to make sure their domestic labor law will be in compliance with the Maritime Labor Convention's minimum labor standards. Port states, for example, let's say Canada, and also United States and also some European countries which receive the maritime carriage service in their countries. So they also need to be involved in the so-called port state control mechanism. And through this port control mechanism, they need to conduct inspection regarding whether a vessel, whether a ship owner have complied with the minimum standards of the Maritime Labor Convention. So if not, then the port state control could basically issue a detain the vessel and or issue correction order for the vessel to make sure they comply with the minimum standards set up by the Maritime Labor Convention. Labor supply states, previously being missing in the maritime labor governance before the establishment of the Maritime Labor Convention, nowadays also assume more and more important liabilities and obligations. For example, nowadays crew agencies, so those crew agencies who work on behalf of international ship owners to recruit seafarers from Philippines, from China, from India, from Ukraine, they also need to make sure that their recruitment standards is in compliance with both of their domestic laws as well as the maritime labor standards. So basically that means all three states, flag states, port states, and labor supply states need to pass legislations to ensure their domestic laws can be meet the minimum standards of Maritime Labor Convention. At the same time, is to work together to ensure that seafarers actually could have decent working conditions at sea. However, as Megan, you just mentioned, during the pandemic, we do have observed that significant infringements, serious infringements of seafarers' employment rights, seafarers' rights to rest, to crew exchanges, to shore leave, to primary medical care and urgent medical care being denied. Some port states at the very beginning of the pandemic immediately denied any crew exchanges requests. That's actually a huge infringement of Maritime Labor Convention, which requests port states has obligation to facilitate crew exchanges and repatriation. And some crew supply states, even more interestingly, deny their citizens repatriation request back to their country. So for example, as we learned from the Canadian Port State Control and Canadian ITF inspector, that some Burma seafarers, the reason they couldn't be repatriated is because their country not, for a certain period, not allow their citizens to be returned to their home country. For the flag states, even though the flag states basically would like to follow, let's say, WHO and IMO's instructions, but sometimes with many requests from the ship owners, the only thing they do is to issue exception. So for example, Panama. So even though many seafarers being stayed on board over 11 months, and then the ship owners submit an exception request to Panama, Panama would say, okay, we can decide that by case to case, considering the hardship faced by ship owners. So as we can see, the international maritime labor governance system, if any of the state, basically, for example, if the port state said that, sorry, we can't coordinate, we can't facilitate any crew exchanges, And for the flag state to maintain the maximum 11-month service on board, it may be difficult and create hardship for seafarers and ship owner. At the same time, the crew supply state saying that, sorry, we can't allow you guys back to your home country. Then it's very difficult to ensure a decent working conditions for seafarers. So as we can see, if there is a lack of effective coordination between the different types of states, in the maritime labor governance, basically to ensure minimum labor standards for seafarers is extremely challenging.
That does indeed sound very challenging. So you mentioned a few times that the domestic states or the particular states, so Panama, Liberia, others, you mentioned China or the Philippines. So each of these states would need to have domestic labor laws that are in accordance with the Maritime Labor Convention 2006. Is that correct? And yes. Is that actually the case? Have all of these individual states passed labor laws to be in accordance with this convention?
That's actually another very interesting question. According to international legal principle, if you're a member of an international convention, it's the obligation to make sure that your domestic law is not against, or you are not going to operating below the minimum standards established by that convention. So if we take in Canada, probably the example, so why there are still difference between this labor law, even though they have all ratified Maritime Labor Convention. So this is basically because the Maritime Labor Convention established the minimum standards. Legally speaking, all the states need to meet their minimum standards, but at the same time, their domestic labor law and domestic labor law legislation and enforcement levels would be different. So for example, let's say during the pandemic, the Canada basically at the very beginning to ensure that seafarers could do crew exchanges in Canada. So with continuous efforts of Transport Canada, also the shipping industry efforts, including maritime charities, including unions, including also some ship owners. And eventually the Transport Canada basically get seafarers issue a ship safety bulletin to ensure that international seafarers could access shore leave in Canada for essential shore leave. So it's basically to make sure that international seafarers still can exercise their basic legal rights in Canada. Well, if we're thinking about a similar thing in other countries, so for example, let's say in China, with the zero clearance policies, basically, even though the Ministry of Transport in China and the industry and the seafarer organization lobbied quite a lot, but under the zero clearance policy, still they cannot get shore leave in China. So sometimes it's also depending on how strong your maritime labor governance engagement process can work. So if this, let's say in Canada and China, you can see both of them are members of Maritime Labor Convention, both of the Ministry of Transport work hard, industry work hard, but that would turn out to be results. So sometimes it's not just about legislation jurisdiction or legislation issues, but also about how to enforce and how to, is there a channel, effective governance engagement and participation channel to make things happen. So that could also explain, in addition to the different labor standards in different countries, and why there would be different results regarding seafarers' rights protection during the pandemic.
Thank you so much, Dazai. That really helps to clarify why it's such a complicated area to have consistent rights for seafarers all over the world, given the number of different factors and entities and states that are involved in each seafarer's journey. So I'd like to now shift again, and moving from the rights of seafarers. Seafarers are not the only people who are significantly and directly affected by marine shipping activity. Many Indigenous people live in communities along all three of Canada's coasts, and their rights and daily lives are impacted by shipping. They depend on ships for the delivery of essential goods, and yet ships disturb the marine environment and pose a risk to traditional uses of their territories. Claudio, can I ask you to come on screen and reflect on how Indigenous rights are being recognized and accounted for in the governance of shipping in Canada? How could we think about the governance of shipping in Canada differently when thinking about the rights of Indigenous people?
Well, thank you, Megan. This is an increasingly important issue that maybe used to be not an issue at all only a few years ago. But all of a sudden, I think we're talking more and more about Indigenous peoples. And there are a few issues. One is connected to sort of the recognition that coastal communities that are Indigenous are not just another stakeholder. They're also right holders, and they have rights that are protected by the Constitution and by sort of an international and national legal context. But so a few things happened in the last few years, and they're all basically reinforcing or making the Indigenous issue more relevant. So international, you have the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples that have been ratified by Canada, and that involves basically a compromise for engaging and respecting traditional knowledge and the rights of people only over their lands and waters. And there is also a process of truth and reconciliation in Canada that is it's ongoing, and there is a compromise by Canada to actually do much more in terms of engaging Indigenous communities and so on. And then on sort of in the same line, there's also the Ocean Protection Plan that kind of this overarching legislation and policy in Canada that is actually also prompting the Canadian government to engage Indigenous peoples more. And I think that there are a few really important challenges that still need to be resolved. I think that Canada is moving on the right directions. There are a few initiatives that are promising, but at the same time, there is some uncertainty about what actually engagement means. It's different. There's a big difference between consultation and true engagement. And true engagement, involves some level of empowerment in this case, Indigenous people. So it's a long process. I think that Canada is learning, and we're not there yet. But again, reconciliation is not necessarily an end in itself. It's also a process. But the other issue, the other challenge is sort of this cross-cultural sort of landscape where these relationships between, let's say, the shipping industry and the Canadian government and the communities is taking place. And again, one of the things that I think is useful to think about is that ships look at marine space as a place of transit, and Indigenous peoples are looking at that marine space as an extension of their homes, and they're interacting with that marine space and resources in ways that are actually different from shipping. So I think that understanding those conceptualizations of the marine space becomes actually quite important.
I think that's a really key distinction that you've raised there, Claudio, just the differences in how shipping companies or ship operators, mariners, and Indigenous communities value and view and make use of and depend upon the marine space. It's a source of food and expression of culture and heritage for Indigenous communities, whereas it's just a place to pass through for ships. They need safe, unimpeded passage, and that's about it. So I think that is we could probably talk a lot more about that, but looking at the time, I'd like to shift now to think a little bit about the perspective of some of the interns. This governance project had funding to specifically enable early career professionals and researchers to be able to engage in an aspect of marine governance that was an interest to them. So reflecting on some of the many ways in which governance shapes the environment in which commercial ships operate, I'd like to ask each of the interns on the panel to reflect on their own experience and briefly share maybe a couple of key takeaways about the research that they did or the learning opportunities they experienced and how that's contributed to their professional or educational journey. Cornelia, could we start with your experience? What aspect of research did you work on, and what stood out for you in that experience? Go ahead whenever you're ready, Cornelia. Or if you're not ready, we can always switch to another. Please just let me know if you would like to pass. Perhaps I could switch to Jessica. Jessica, are you able to respond to the question of what aspect of research did you work on, and what stood out about the experience for you?
Yes, thank you, Megan. So hello, my name is Jessica Cuccinelli, and I was working under Dr. Pillow and Dr. Gorland on subtask 2C, which aimed to understand shipping risk governance in Canada, specifically in regards to emergency preparedness and response for marine oil spills and maritime search and rescue. So our research looked at which regulatory frameworks exist, how risks are assessed and managed, the roles and responsibilities of each agency and how they're implemented, whether Indigenous and experiential knowledge have been incorporated, what decision tools exist, what are some of the challenges and kind of areas for improvement, as well as how interested parties can also be involved in some of these discussions, should they wish to be included. So kind of long-winded. And of this, our deliverables included a comprehensive report, a blog post, and 2 journal articles, one of which was recently published in the Journal of Marine Policy. So that's a short summary of how I was involved in this project. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about my experience. So I joined the MyTax internship while completing my master's in marine management from Dalhousie University. Okay. And I was hired on shortly after to continue working on related projects with my supervisors. And then I accepted a position with the Canadian Coast Guard as a risk analyst for Arctic Search and Rescue, where I'm working on the Ramsard program, which is something that I've referenced quite frequently throughout this project. So it's kind of it was a full circle moment for me in that I likely would not have explored this career path had I not been working on this project. And now I get to continue my research in collaboration with Canadian SAR partners and still get the opportunity to connect with my supervisors and other research teams who continue to share their knowledge and support with me. So it's been a really great learning opportunity, and it's really helped launch my career. Thank you.
That's great, and that's so exciting. Congratulations on your role with the Coast Guard. Glad you're there keeping us all safe. I just saw a note from Cornelia that she was having some technical issues. Cornelia, are you able to speak now? Or has it now?
Hi.
Has it
Yes.
The audio is very slow, Cornelia. Can you try speaking without your video?
Slow, Cornelia. Can you try speaking without your video? Yes. How does it sound now?
Much better. Go ahead.
Fantastic. Thank you for the question. And so I worked with Professor Al and Professor Desai on the part part 1 and part 2 of this project, and I must say that it's something that has been one of the highlights of my academic career till date, and it's really an experience I'm going to bring with me in my professional career as I continue to, build up my profession here in Canada as a lawyer. I've always had a curiosity for the maritime space since I was a teenager in high school, and so coming to Canada, one of my goals was to go into the marine environmental law program at Dow, and this research was just the highlight of my studies at Dow, in the sense that it just really broadened my understanding and enlightened me in the global space and how maritime governance is really viewed across the board. And it just, again, further reinstated my interest and curiosity in that space, and it's really something that I'm looking to go into in the near future in my profession. I hope to land in the maritime space as a maritime lawyer in the coming future. So thank you for the question, and I'm sorry about the tech difficulty. I'm not sure why my computer is just being slow today, but thank you, Megan.
Thanks so much, Cornelia. Technical issues, they happen. Really great to hear that working on the project has kind of opened up the knowledge and appreciation of the international space of maritime law. There's certainly lots of potential. Best wishes for your next move in your career. So at this point, we have just a few minutes left, and so I'd like to ask the panelists if they're able to turn their cameras on. And we're going to have a couple of questions that we've received from the audience. So perhaps we can start with Floris Orland, if you are able to contribute to this question, and maybe others feel free to jump in if you'd like. So we have a question about Canada's role as a convener for multilateral international efforts to make shipping safer. So could I ask you to reflect on the opportunities that you see for Canada to take a leading role in establishing conventions or establishing coordinated measures to improve shipping safety and avert potential future disasters in marine shipping?
Yeah, thank you. That's, of course, a great question. Of course, because governance is multi-level and there's many different sort of organizations involved. Canada, of course, has an important role at the international level and International Maritime Organization, where the conventions are developed, and there are different committees, of course, that focus on specific aspects of shipping. Canada has a role in that, as other countries do. Apart from that, and maybe a little bit more, where Canada can actually take a leading role and does actually take a leading role often, is in specific committees in more technical organizations. As one example, in which I'm also actually involved, is the International Association for Aids to Navigation and Lighthouse Authorities, where the Canadian Coast Guard helps to develop guidelines for assessing risks involving navigation. For instance, in the work plan that is going to be the next work plan, they're going to look at offshore wind safety measures, for instance, like how shipping interacts with wind farms and safety measures related to that. So that's only one example. There's of course other issues, other risks and other spatial area-based approaches, and but Canada actually does take a leading role in that, together with some Northern European nations often. That's just some reflection on that, but there's of course more to say about that, but I think that's what I have to share about that at the moment.
Thanks so much, Floris. Yeah, there certainly are many avenues for involvement in terms of shipping safety. Ron, given your research and background in the area of shipping safety, is there anything that you'd like to add to the question on what Canada can do at the international level to make shipping safer?
Well, I know that Canada, I'm not a legal or legislative person like some of the people on the panel, but I know that Canada has been and continues to be very involved in these issues continuously and advancing issues at the IMO. The one I'm most familiar with recently, of course, is the Polar Code, where a lot of individuals in Canada doing their research and a lot of companies and the government investigated a lot of issues, came up with a lot of the recommendations that ended up in the Polar Code, which is for addressing, environmental issues in the north, but largely safety as well. And so I think our record speaks for itself, and that we've got a capability and a lot of emphasis on improving shipping in many regards that are brought to the international community. That's my take on it.
Thank you so much. Is there anybody else that would like to add a couple of cents, probably not much more than 2 cents, on the topic of Canada's role as a convener for international safety?
Well, just maybe not on international safety, but I mean, sorry, I'll go back to the Indigenous issue because I think it's important. And Indigenous people, small island people, so they don't have a lot of let's talk about Indigenous peoples. Don't have a lot of voice, in these debates at all. And if you look at IMO, for instance, recently the Inuit Circumpolar Council, which is the international organization representing Inuit, has been recently given provisional advisory role, I think is the title, in IMO, being the first Indigenous organization to have a sort of a formal place in IMO. But I think there's still a lot, a long way to go in terms of listening to those voices that are usually unheard. And I think that Canada has a role maybe in maybe facilitating or convening some of those discussions internationally.
Thank you, Claudio. And I think that's a great shout out for something Canada can do to contribute more broadly and use its experience operating at the IMO to benefit countries that, as you say, are countries and Indigenous peoples of those countries that don't have that same access and same voice. And the Inuit Circumpolar Council, they have the provisional consultative status, and I know they're working on getting that made to be permanent, and I hope they're able to achieve that. It'll be a real landmark at the IMO if they can do that and pave the way for others to also get that same status and access. So I think we're at the end of our time today, and I want to thank all of our panelists so much for your contributions and sharing your expertise and knowledge. And I'd like to also give another plug to the audience. For more information on this, please do go and look at the research page on the Clear Seas website on Demystifying Maritime Governance. We have the full report and a lot more of the details than we were able to touch on in today's conversation. And so I will hand back over to Jen for closing us out today.
Yeah, thank you, Meghan, and thank you everyone as well for joining. I'll say again what Meghan just said. Thank you on behalf of Clear Seas to the speakers for joining us today and for facilitating such a great conversation. It's great to see the level of interest in the work with a number of people showing up for the webinar today and to have an engaged audience with the thoughtful questions for our panelists. So big thanks again to the whole team for who contributed to this work. And if you're interested to learn more about the project itself and the results, the link to the project is in the chat. But you can find a lot more information about marine governance and pollution with some of the questions that were coming up in the chat through some of Clear Seas resources online at clearseas.org. We will also share a recording of today's webinar on the project page of the website. So if you have any further want to go back and listen to some of the answers from the panelists, they'll be there as well. And if you'd like to stay in touch with Clear Seas, please do so by signing up for our quarterly newsletter and checking us out and following us on the different social media platforms. I think we are on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook currently. Please watch out for new research and projects that come out through these different channels and on our website. And I think with that, thank you all again and have a great and amazing day.